Today, we're diving into one of the most fascinating and, honestly, most consequential figures of the entire 20th century, Mikhail Gorbachev. His name is just completely tied to the end of an empire and, really, the end of a whole world order. And here's the central puzzle of his entire story, the thing that makes it so compelling. In 1985, he's the guy chosen to save the Soviet Union, to be its great modernizer. But just 6 years later, that same superpower, it's just gone. It literally ceased to exist. So what on earth happened? How did it all come apart so incredibly fast?
Well, to really get how it all ended, we have to rewind and go back to the beginning. We've got to look at the arrival of a leader who was totally unlike anyone the Soviet Union had ever seen before.
I mean, you have to understand, after a whole string of old, frail leaders, Gorbachev was a complete shock to the system. He was younger, he was energetic, he could speak without just reading from his script, and he was openly talking about the need for major change. He was a product of the Communist Party, for sure, but he didn't look or sound anything like its past.
And the system he inherited? It was a superpower that was basically rotting from the inside out. Yeah, on paper, the Soviet Union was this mighty force, but in reality, the economy was at a dead standstill. It was falling way behind the West in technology, and the whole leadership just felt ancient. Gorbachev knew, deep down, that something had to change, and fast.
So what did he do? He introduced two pretty radical new policies. They were two Russian words that, believe it or not, would soon become famous all around the globe and would come to define his entire time in power. Okay, so first up was Perestroika, which literally means restructuring. This was his big plan to fix the country's decaying economy. And the key thing to get here is that he wasn't trying to tear down socialism, not at all. He was trying to fix it, to make it actually work in the modern world.
So he starts introducing these little bits of market economics into this super rigid, centrally planned system. All of a sudden, for the first time, you could have small private businesses, state-run factories got a little more say in how they operated. The goal, of course, was to jumpstart the economy. But the immediate result? Well, it was mostly just confusion and instability, long before anyone saw any real benefits.
Now, at the same time as all these economic changes, he rolled out something that was maybe even more explosive: Glasnost, or openness. And this was a massive shift in how the Soviet government talked to its own people. It was all about letting some sunlight into a system that had been sealed shut for decades.
And wow, the impact was immediate. It was like a dam breaking. Suddenly, newspapers started reporting actual news. People were openly discussing the darkest parts of Soviet history, like Stalin's purges. You had people openly criticizing the government's failures. See, Gorbachev wanted to kind of energize the country, but what he'd really done was open a Pandora's box. Once you let people start talking, it's pretty much impossible to tell them to stop.
So with these two huge new ideas in motion, the really rigid structure of the Soviet Union and its empire, well, it started to show some massive cracks.
And the speed of the change was just breathtaking, with 1989 being the absolute key year. Gorbachev pulls the troops out of that disastrous war in Afghanistan, and then, and this is huge, he basically signals that he will not use the Soviet army to keep the communist governments in Eastern Europe in power. The result was this incredible chain reaction. One after another, those governments just fell, leading to that iconic moment when the Berlin Wall came crashing down. The Cold War was, for all intents and purposes, over.
But here's the wild irony in all this. While Gorbachev is being hailed as this great peacemaker all over the world, the situation back home in the Soviet Union is just spinning out of control. The very changes he had started were now threatening to tear the country itself apart.
Glasnost gave a powerful new voice to all these nationalist feelings that have been suppressed for decades in places like Lithuania, Georgia, and Ukraine. Perestroika was actually making the economy worse in the short term, with shortages of even basic stuff like bread and soap. And for the first time, a real political opposition was forming. Some people were demanding even faster reforms, while others were screaming for a return to the old strict ways. The whole system was being pulled in opposite directions.
And all this internal division, all this tension, it finally came to a head in one incredibly dramatic event in the summer of 1991. It was a last-ditch effort by the old guard to literally turn back the clock.
A group of top-level communist officials, we're talking the vice president, the head of the KGB, they put Gorbachev under house arrest while he's on vacation. They roll tanks into Moscow, announce a state of emergency, and try to wrestle back control to reverse all the changes that they believed were destroying the country.
But the coup was a spectacular failure. It completely fell apart in just 3 days, mostly because of public resistance led by guys like Boris Yeltsin. And its effect? It was the exact opposite of what the plotters wanted. It didn't save the old system. It absolutely shattered whatever authority was left. The Communist Party was totally discredited, and one after another, the Soviet republics rushed to declare their full independence. It was over.
After that failed coup, the end came really, really fast, leaving Gorbachev with a legacy that was completely different from the one he had ever set out to create.
On Christmas Day, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev went on television and resigned as president of the Soviet Union, a country that, for all practical purposes, didn't even exist anymore. A few moments later, the red Soviet flag with the hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the very last time.
And this right here, this captures the central tragedy of his political life. He never, ever wanted to destroy the USSR. He genuinely wanted to save it. He really believed he could reform it, make it more humane, make it work better. But the system was just too brittle, and the forces of change that he unleashed were just way too powerful to control.
The very tools he used to try and renew the system, openness and restructuring, they ended up being the very things that caused its complete collapse. It was a perfect and kind of tragic example of unintended consequences on a massive, world-changing scale.
So, how is he remembered? Well, it's really a tale of two totally different stories. In the West, he's often seen as a hero, right? The guy who ended the Cold War without a huge bloody conflict. But back in Russia and many of the former Soviet countries, he's often the person blamed for the chaos, the economic pain, and the loss of national pride that came with a collapse. And that kind of leaves us with this final, really tough question. Because Gorbachev's story isn't just about one man or one country. It's this profound case study. It makes us ask, can a deeply rigid authoritarian system ever really be reformed from the inside without it just breaking apart? Or is the very act of trying to fix it what makes its collapse inevitable? It's a question that leaders and the rest of us are still grappling with today.